Hello, and welcome to Dead to Rights, the podcast. I want to thank our listeners from all over the world for joining us on the pod. At Dead to Rights, we've got one single mission: to bring our listeners a wide array of insights into the book industry from the points of view of authors, book designers, booksellers, publishers, in short, anyone connected with the industry. If you're a reader, this is where you'll meet your favorite authors or discover new talent. If you're a writer, stay with us for excellent tips on writing and on working within our industry. Through April, we brought you interviews with such established talents as John Rakestraw, Janet Kello, John Strother, Melody Campbell, and today we're pleased and proud to touch base with organized crime expert and freelance journalist Stephen G. Metelsky. Coming up in May, we'll reach out to authors Junying Kirk, Judy Penn Shallock, Russell Parkway, and the ever-popular Cyrus Webb. We'll talk about their works, their experiences in the industry, their tips for newbie writers, and so much more. One of the topics I'm most interested in is what motivates us to write. From where does this passion present itself in our lives? I can recall our grade 6 teacher, Mrs. Milbrandt, who told us there are 4 primary reasons one will write: to inform, to educate, which is not quite the same as simply informing, to persuade, or to entertain. As a writer of fiction, my primary goal will always be to entertain, but I have to contend here and now that there is a 5th motivation that we are all aware of peripherally as writers, but that does not receive enough attention: pure artistic expression as delivered in the written word. By this I am referring to the essential beauty of words, their power, their intrinsic value, their ability, when well chosen, to stand on their own as art. Yesterday I finished reading A Higher Loyalty by James Comey. It was certainly a well-written and a deserving read. I'll confess I bought the book, but I ended up listening to most of it via Audible, which I highly recommend. It's in the author's own voice, and it's a good voice, bringing my ears closer to an understanding of what Comey wished to convey. This was a terrific example of the first 3 motivations outlined by Mrs. Milbrandt so long ago in grade 6: to inform, to educate, and to persuade. Comey set out to tell the public what he could of the unclassified findings of his work as head of the FBI in these troubling times, leading up to his abrupt firing in May of 2017. So he wished to inform. He also wanted to educate us about the workings of the U.S. Justice Department, the intricacies of which many of us are loosely aware at best. He did a good job of that. I came away with a clearer understanding. Naturally, he also wanted to persuade the listeners of the validity of the reasons behind some of his more controversial decisions made in the final year of his employment. Of course, as he points out, we all listen with our preconceived notions firmly in place. But that aside, I do commend his persuasiveness. His manner was humble, and yet he wrote with the authority that comes from real-life experience, a combination that I do find to be persuasive. None of that matters if the book fails to entertain. Comey's use of higher-level concepts and themes like loyalty and honesty were compelling to me and made for a terrific read independent of the other elements of the book. In all, I recommend it, and I also recommend the Audible edition. But I must argue here and now that there is a 5th purpose or motivation behind writing, and that is for the sheer pleasure of engaging in the beauty, the expression of artistry that flows with a well-chosen phrase, a poetic prose. Such is the book I have just cracked open today and begun to read, titled The Colony of Unrequited Dreams by author Wayne Johnston. Every word so far, every single phrase, is placed into the story with care and craftsmanship. The result, an undeniable reminder that to write is, first and foremost, to engage in a beautiful art form, no less so than does a painter or a musician or a dancer. The result, in my opinion, is mastery. I'm going to love this book. We've had a tough week here in my beloved city of Toronto. On Monday, April 23rd, a white van purposefully crashed into a crowd of pedestrians at the corner of Yonge and Finch. We don't yet fully know the motivations behind the attack, but the early reports indicate it was the result of yet another round of misogynistic rage. The driver, whom I will not glorify by naming here, had posted material that indicated his hatred of women and his seething fury at their rejection of him. I won't cast judgments here, although I know it sounds as if I am. I suspect enough judgments are being cast even as I speak. But I will say that my love and my sorrow go out to the victims and their families, as well as to the family of the suspect, who must be horrified by the actions of one of their own. Such is the world we now live in which we attempt to work, to thrive, to build our little nests of love and order, and to create art. Such is the world in which we strive to be always prepared. And of course, we understand, even as we do so, that preparation is the ultimate in impossibility. And now I'd like to read to you from a story that first appeared in Septil and Other Places, a collection of mine from a few years back, and then later appeared in my 2016 collection titled North on the Yellowhead and Other Crime Stories. And this short story is titled Prepared. While you listen, I'd like you to think about what being prepared means to you. "Helen," she said, "I've come to prepare you." The woman spoke in an urgent voice. Her hair was a mixture of silver and gold, advancing years in denial, given the lie by timeless blue eyes. Helen had never seen her before, but she seemed familiar. Helen woke with a start and squinted at the bedside table. 2 a.m. No sounds other than the natural creaking of an aging house, old but with good bones. Then she remembered. Z had called at 11 p.m. to say she would be staying overnight with her friend, Claire. Helen guessed her daughter was likely spending the night with her boyfriend, Sam, but Z was a young woman. She could do as she pleased. Helen was grateful that, at the age of 20, her daughter still called when she wasn't coming home. Z never gave her cause to worry. She'd raised Z to be an independent woman. Her daughter was strong, beautiful, and thoughtful. Helen reached for her crutches and strapped them on. She was careful to use both when she was home alone. How embarrassing would that be, to fall down in the bathroom with her drawers around her ankles? She did her business, washed her hands, ruminating on the face from her dream. So familiar, and yet she couldn't place it. A depth of kindness in those eyes. She shook her head, unable to match the face to memory. She glanced in the mirror at her own blue-gray eyes and golden hair. Well, chemical gold, but still vibrant thanks to Z. Z would not allow Helen to let herself go. Leaning on her left crutch, she reached for a brush and smoothed the tangles before heading back to bed. The physical struggle of moving on crutches stirred her heart in an uncomfortable palpitation. The moment passed. Soon she was asleep. "Helen, please listen to me." The woman touched her shoulder. "What do you want?" "Your father sent me to prepare you." A quiet rage took hold of Helen, tightening her fists. She stood tall, as she often did in her dreams, without crutches, without pain, a force to be reckoned with. "Don't mention my father," she said. "He was a wife-beater, a child molester, and a drunken bastard. I don't have time to remember him." "Your heavenly Father is sorry for your suffering, Helen. He knows pain has been a large part of your life. How can he call himself a loving God? My entire life has been about misery, from those early years of abuse to this illness that makes me a burden to the husband who left me, and now to his child. You're not a burden, Helen. You are loved, and your life, the woman added, has not been all about pain. That's true, Helen nodded, her anger subsiding. I have Z. I am thankful for that. Helen, the woman said, I need to prepare you. It's all right, Helen said. I've been prepared for years, since this illness claimed me. Tell our father he can take me when he's ready. But Z will be all right, Helen said, suddenly calm. She knew this would happen. I've always been honest with her, taught her to be strong. Helen smiled again at the thought of her daughter. Z was doing well at university. Helen had prepared her for this day. She never wanted to be a burden to Z. It was time to let her girl have a life of her own. Throughout the years of bitterness and sorrow, there had always been one gift. Z. Helen's pride and joy, her offering to the world. Knowing she would leave behind such a fine young woman made it easier for Helen to face mortality. I've become tired of this struggle, she said. Tell our father, if he can forgive me for being a stubborn, angry fool, then I can forgive him for giving me this pain. I'm ready to make my peace. Helen, the angel said, for she must be an angel, so lovely, with such kindness in her sad eyes. She looked like someone Helen knew. Please hear me, she said. You need to be prepared. It's okay, Helen said, letting the dream angel drift away. Whenever you're ready, take me to him. I'm prepared. With a feeling of contentment, Helen took her leave of the angel, allowing her mind to wander into other rooms, other dreams. I'd like to leave now, Z said, glancing over her shoulder at a young man on the other side of the room. Are you okay? Sam asked. You seem preoccupied. I'm all right. I'm just tired. It's late. I've got classes tomorrow. Did you call your mom? I told her I was staying with Claire. Good. It's noisy in here, Sam said. I'll go outside and call a cab. Sam kissed Z on the forehead. She was 1 in a million. Beautiful, kind, studious, and loving. He was a lucky guy. She watched him leave the party, hoping he wouldn't be gone too long. Hi, Z. She nearly groaned out loud as the other man approached, but good manners kicked in and she managed to restrain herself. Hi, Richard, she said. Who's the guy? That's my boyfriend, Sam. Some boyfriend. No offense, but he looks like a girl. Why'd he ditch you? He's calling a cab. We're leaving now, Helen said. You'll have to excuse me. Z stood. She could feel her Scots-Irish blood rising. Her mother hadn't raised her to tolerate this kind of nonsense. Richard had been a nuisance for weeks, but now he was becoming insufferable. She didn't want to make a scene at the party, but she would if she had to. Take it easy, Z, he said. I just want to talk. You've been avoiding me. Stop following me, Richard. I saw you at the library today. I was studying, he said. It's a free country. Excuse me, she said, trying to push past him. Richard held her arm. You never gave me a chance, he said. Let me go. The knife's blade was sharp and mercifully swift. She hardly felt it slide past her rib cage and into her heart. Her hearing became muted and at the same time strangely acute. She was aware of horrified shouts as her friends looked up in alarm. Her blood crashed in her ears, drowning out their cries. Her closest friend, Claire, rushed to her side. She watched as someone ran to get Sam. He pushed through the crowd and knelt in time to hear her whisper, "My mother." The end. And this has been a story that I wrote to show us that even when we think we're prepared, the twists and turns of life and fiction, both life and art, will often take us quite by surprise. Thank you for listening. And now stay with us as we bring you our interview with organized crime expert Stephen G. Metelsky. Stephen is not only an organized crime expert, he's also a freelance writer, a professor, a criminologist, a keynote speaker, and a former intelligence officer. Stephen publishes a variety of crime stories and research articles on his site, underworldstories.com. So stay with us. We're going to get Stephen on the line right now. Let it rot.
Donna.
Good morning, Stephen. Welcome to Dead to Rights. How are you today?
Oh, I'm very good, and thanks very much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure. I wanted to have you on because I know that you're a freelance crime journalist and an expert in organized crime in particular. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay, good. So I was hoping that you could tell our listeners a little bit about some of the cases that you've been exposed to in your research, in particular the McCarthy serial killer, the Musitano murder. We have a few different ones, organized crime and gambling. And I know that you've also got a course, a college course under development.
That's correct. I'd probably like to start. I'm currently working on something as it pertains to the Bruce McArthur case, because it's a very tragic case, but very much ongoing in the public eye. The one interesting thing, I posted something about a month and a half ago back in January on one of my social media accounts about the case. And Bruce McArthur is definitely a serial killer. Anytime a perpetrator has committed murder involving 3 or more victims over a certain span of time, they're classified as a serial killer. The one concerning thing I have with the McArthur case and the perpetrator in this matter is he's 66 years of age, and your atypical serial killer starts offending on average in their 20s.
Yes.
And typically the only thing that stops a serial killer from committing these heinous crimes is incarceration or death.
That's right.
Or some other form of incapacitation, like hypothetically like an injury or something like that. But McArthur has been, to the best of my knowledge, never been incarcerated. So my concern, and then this is what I posted on one of my accounts, is that he has been, no doubt, this is the first time he's been caught. This isn't the first time he's committed these murderous actions. So in my personal and professional opinion, the concerning thing, and I think we're seeing that now with the victims that the police in Toronto are finding, is that I think he's been doing this for several years.
I would not be at all surprised. I agree with you. My research into serial killers for my crime writing has led me to believe that this is something that they do over a span of time, and they simply don't stop. It's particularly heinous because it's taken, well, from a personal perspective, because I live in Toronto, and I have friends who live very, very close to the house in question. What do we know about McArthur's past? Has he always lived in that area, or did he move there from elsewhere?
I'm not quite sure. I'm literally at the tip of the iceberg for getting into the story, researching it, and writing it, because it's still unfolding. I was talking with some colleagues, and what I reiterated was it's a very daunting task for the Toronto police, because if you take into consideration that he's been doing this for decades, and that was one of my assessments, that because he's never been incarcerated, It's the first time he's been caught. The police now have to essentially work in reverse chronologically and literally find out where Bruce McArthur has lived, where he's worked, his social circles. They have to compare his location and address history with other potential cases of either missing persons or unsolved homicides or serious or aggravated assaults in certain communities he's lived. So I'm just at the tip of delving into that a little bit further. But for the Toronto Police, this case could literally take years in terms of tracking down his potential criminal past, which is definitely apparent.
Yes, these types of investigations, for our listeners who may not be as knowledgeable about true crime incidents, they tend to be very glacial in their procedure. And so it does seem like nothing is happening, but behind the scenes something is. And Stephen, I'd love to have you back maybe next year when we know more about this to talk to us more about it. Just throwing that out there early on,
I would love to come back because definitely at that point, not only will the case have evolved and progressed, but it give me an opportunity to probably share some of the writing and research I've been able to do on that case.
Yes, I don't want to leave this case yet either, because there are other aspects to it besides what you pointed out about how serial killers, male serial killers, the profile, they tend to be killing from early in their adult lives and carry on until they are physically stopped by a silver bullet of some type. But there's another aspect to this, in that like so many of his type of killer, he targeted vulnerable people. What can you tell us about his victims and their victimology?
Yeah, I like how you use the word victimology, because we kind of get lost in focusing on the perpetrator and the crimes, which is, definitely at the forefront. But the real tragedy here is the victims. And killers like this, I'll segue into an interesting case as well that happened in Rochester, New York, back in the 80s with Arthur Shawcross. Very similar to Bruce McArthur, because they do target victims that they hope will not be, reported as missing to the police, or people they feel that are more susceptible to being victims, unfortunately.
Yes.
The Arthur Shawcross case is actually such an interesting dynamic in the world of criminology, because he murdered two young children, horrible offenses back in 1972. He was incarcerated. There was some plea bargaining. A person like him never ever should have been paroled or released, but he only ended up serving 12 years of a 25-year sentence. So he was paroled.
Wow.
And between 1988 and 89, he murdered several prostitutes in the Rochester, New York area. So he definitely was a serial killer, but very similar. He was targeting victims who obviously were working in that line of work, who unfortunately there's not a lot of connectivity with family, and so with a lot of these killers, they try to target people that hopefully won't bring the attention to authorities.
That's right. Won't be reported missing with any kind of alacrity and that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, may be estranged from their families, may not have that kind of network.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing with Bruce McArthur, and when you look at serial killers, there's always some type of motive behind their criminality, and most times, not always, but there's usually a deviant sexual motive behind their offenses, and this is definitely apparent with Bruce McArthur. And I just spoke about Arthur Shawcross a few minutes ago. Definitely the same thing in that case. So when you start comparing a lot of the modus operandi with these type killers, you really start to find a lot of commonalities with not only their signature in terms of who they're targeting and how they're committing their criminal offenses.
Yes. Now, what year did you say that Shawcross was paroled? And I have a reason for asking, sorry.
Well, I'm not sure the exact year he definitely in the 80s, but between 88 and 89 was
Okay.
when a lot of victims were unfortunately being murdered and targeted in the New York area.
I'm curious as to, I can't recall what year John Douglas really came to the front with his profiling work in the FBI. And I wonder if there's a tie-in, if John Douglas's work had been more prominent at the time of Shawcross's release, whether he even would have been released, because what we now know about these killers.
Yeah, John Douglas was back in the 1970s. I've actually read a lot of his books.
Okay, yes, so have I. I just couldn't remember the time frame. Yeah.
Yeah, and there was another really excellent profiler by the name of Roy Hazelwood. I believe they brought him in for the Paul Bernardo case before they were able to identify who the perpetrators were.
Say that name again, Stephen, if you don't mind.
Roy Hazelwood.
Okay, very good. I'll look him up, and I hope our listeners will too. And he was effective in the Paul Bernardo case.
Yeah, I'm just this off the top of my head. I'm from memory. I'm 99% sure they brought Roy in to do a criminal behavioral profile of the perpetrators in those heinous crimes out in the Niagara area in Burlington.
Right, Homolka and Bernardo. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, that is perhaps the most sensational type of killing and crime, and certainly the most heinous as far as most of us are concerned. But you've studied a lot of different types of crime. And, for example, tell us about the Musitano murder.
Yeah, the Musitano murder is very interesting because I have a background with organized crime history, and I've worked it in my previous employment. And Angelo was murdered back in May of 2017 in his driveway. And the Musitano family in Hamilton, the brothers, Pasquale, he's known on the street as Fat Pat, and his brother, a very powerful crime family. Back in the 1997, they hired or paid hitman Kenneth Murdoch to murder Johnny Pops Papalia, who at that time was the boss of Hamilton and outward. Historically, Johnny Pops Papalia was connected with the Buffalo organized crime of the Stefano Magaddino family. And Johnny Pops Papalia was a very powerful mobster. And what the Musitano brothers did was they hired Kenneth Murdoch to shoot Johnny Papalia. And then Johnny Pop's right-hand man, Carmen Barillero, who lived down in Niagara Falls, Kenneth Murdoch, a short while after, was contracted to kill him as well. So there's a lot of irony in the mafia, especially with organized crime hits. And Angelo Musitano was shot in the driveway of his home, practically 20 years to the anniversary of Johnny Pop's murder. Not to say that this is a revenge motive from 20 years ago, but it's quite possible.
Yes, we don't know for certain, but it certainly would be a bookend type killing, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and the motives are endless because when you look at the evolution of organized crime, we'll go back a few decades. You had traditional organized crime as Italian-based, and you have outlaw motorcycle gangs. You have Asian organized crime, Eastern European organized crime, and years ago, these groups typically didn't amalgamate and work in partnership with other organized criminal groups. But over time, these criminal groups realized that, hey, you know what, if we partner together, our ultimate shared goal is making money and profitability. Mm-hmm. And they started working together. So when you look at the Musitano murder, these traditional Italian-based organized crime families have been working with various factions of outlaw motorcycle gangs and other organized criminal groups. Mm-hmm. And that's externally. When you look at the internal within those traditional groups, the Musitanos are part of what's called the Ndrangheta, so it's a Calabrian-based, from Calabria, Italy, organized crime. And then you have, up in Montreal, with what's remaining of the Rizzuto crime family, they're typically referred to as La Cosa Nostra, which is Sicilian-based.
Okay.
So even within organized crime circles, yes, you will get Calabrian mobsters working with Sicilian mobsters, but the big push right now, especially in Ontario, is the Ndrangheta families from Calabria. So whether it's the profits from illegal gaming, whether it was a beef in the underworld, whether it's a criminal takeover where other organized groups within Ndrangheta or outside of that circle, want to get rid of the Musitanos so they can, take over their rackets.
And I'm sure you'll be following. I'm sure that you'll be following the investigation into the murder as it progresses. And before we go any further, I want to stop you and get you to tell your website address to our listeners, because you've got some terrific headlines there that really caught my eye. For example, No Mystery to This Murdoch, which is a touch on the case where Murdoch was hired to kill the mobster 20 years ago, and the Whacked in Waterdown. I love that headline because I know people in Waterdown. I'm not going to say where they live because I don't want to get them whacked. But anyways, your website, Stephen, please.
Well, thank you very much, Don. I have a blog. It's Underworld Stories, all one word, underworldstories.com. And it showcases some of the research I've had published, some of the true crime articles that I've had published as well. And then ongoing work and research, I'll be uploading that to that website as well. And thank you very much for following that up and the plug for my website.
You're welcome. I didn't want to forget because I really I'd made myself a note about these terrific titles, and I'd gone and I'd read some of these stories, and they're so well researched and so well written. I really encourage people to go and pay a visit. But not to keep you on this little plug, I know you want to get on to telling us about the gambling and organized crime research that you've done, and you raised a question whether these actually are victimless crimes.
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, and not to generalize, but when people think of an illegal gaming house where poker's being played, there is a tendency, without looking further beneath the surface, that what's illegal gambling? Playing a game of cards. That's not a victimless crime, but these rackets in organized crime circles make organized crime members millions and millions of dollars.
Yes.
When you look at, I'll take just an example of one gaming house, typically run by different factions of organized crime, but in my research, I dealt specifically with traditional organized crime, Italian-based, and how they use their relationship with outlaw motorcycle gangs. So a typical gaming house would consist of 5 or 6 different poker tables. They will have a professional dealer. These games are not open to anybody. You can't just walk into one of these houses. These games typically go out with direct invitations to people. They're secretive locations. The house always wins at these games. So you have these people who are going to the games. Typically, there's some enforcement there in terms of typically bikers that will protect the houses from being ripped off.
Mm-hmm.
But when you look at the basic rudimentary level of poker games, thousands of dollars just for one house can be made in one night. And if you have 20, 30, 40 of these on the go, that's just one racket and one form of gambling. We're not even talking about the even more lucrative online gambling rackets that organized crime has literally got right into in the last few years.
And whenever there's a great deal of money at stake, there is almost certainly someone going to be hurt or someone living under threat of being hurt. The one just can't go without the other. And the other thing that amazes me is you touched on the house always wins. Is there anyone who doesn't know that the house always wins? Can we pump that simple fact up for listeners?
Yeah, gambling is an addiction. It's literally a disease for some people because there's this tendency for, if you win once out of say 150 or 200 attempts at gambling, And that's how people really start losing a lot of money. But the offshoots of criminality at these games, and where the violence comes in, is these people are gambling typically with money borrowed from organized criminals. And this money that's borrowed or lent out to them comes with a high rate of interest that typically most people cannot pay back. So what they don't realize is in a week's time when they're supposed to pay the vig or vigorish or the interest, they can't even pay the principal. That's where the enforcement comes in, and people get seriously hurt or people have been murdered.
With all of these organized crimes, we really do need to scratch the surface. I mean, gambling is one of them, certainly, where because there's an addictive element, people really must gamble when they're addicted. They really must, and therefore they must borrow these large amounts of money at high rates of interest. And so behind the scenes, and I'm thinking also about pornography. I know that you haven't written extensively about pornography, but it's another similar thing that people love to think of it as a victimless crime. But when you consider young adults and in many cases children being forced to perform for this industry, that's not victimless.
Absolutely. And that's, something perhaps we can talk about in our next interview is the whole issue of trafficking. That is a whole separate issue that I'm very not only concerned but passionate about getting the word out and educating people about really what is going on in our society today. And that's a huge issue.
And I raise it too because it segues to something else that I've been very interested in lately. We're going to be airing down the road, but I want to let our listeners know that we're speaking on February 17th, which is a lovely Saturday morning in Toronto. We've just seen the intense rise of the Me Too movement throughout certainly the Western world, I think probably the entire world. And at your website, Stephen, you've got a dark little story that I found in there, nestled amongst the mob stories, about the murder of Shannon Cruz and her family in Grimsby, Ontario. It seemed like a detour from your usual stories, and so I'm wondering what prompted you to fasten on to this story and delve into the research of it.
Yeah, thanks, Donna. I'm originally from Toronto and Mississauga, but for the last 20-plus years I've been living out in the Niagara region, and I was living out here at that time when that very tragic set of circumstances occurred in Grimsby. So it was really struck a personal chord with me. The second thing, and these aren't in any particular order, but anytime there's a domestic situation that escalates to this point, where there's several victims, and the one real tragedy, is the murder of the 6-year-old Shannon's daughter.
Yes.
So it really hit close to home for me. And the one thing when we talked about victimology, it's we tend, and when I say we, the media, writers, sometimes we tend to get so ensconced in the whole notion of the actual crime and the perpetrators, but it was kind of a way for me to, not to forget the victims of this horrible set of circumstances as well.
Now, the Me Too movement at its core is a movement about sexual power, but I think most women at least understand that it's really about female power beyond just sexual situations, and it involves domestic situations like the Shannon Cruz case and the murder of her and her entire family, including her 6-year-old daughter, which was really, it was a power move, and power seems to corrupt, doesn't it?
It does, and domestic violence and domestic abuse is something that needs to be reported.
Yes.
Very similar.
Yes.
The underlying sentiment behind the Me Too movement. It has to be reported, It has to be documented.
Yeah. Now, people like yourself who do the hard work of actually researching and writing about these terrible cases, I know what a toll it can take just from research I've done for my crime fiction, never mind true crime reporting and bringing this to the people's attention. One of the things that we've just lived through this week is the terrible shooting and the deaths of 17 people in the Florida high school. Tell us what you're learning about that so far, and I know that you're going to be researching that, and we'll talk about that in the future as well.
Yeah, I wrote a research article a few years back that was published in Blue Line magazine about anatomy of a school shooting and some of the common behavioral precursors. And another horrible, tragic situation. The frustrating thing for me, not only as a person, but as a researcher, having delved into this type of work and research, is a lot of people think the person just snapped and committed this crime. There is a lot of truth to that. Mm-hmm. But what people don't realize is people close to these future perpetrators, before the crime's even been committed, these people are going through typically a number of different stressors in their life. And it's very apparent in a lot of these cases where there's behavioral cues or footprints on social media. And this is already, in my early research into this tragedy in Parkland, Florida, it's already becoming apparent that the shooter had taken photographs of himself with weapons, actually there was a tipster, I'm looking into this a little bit further, that reported Nicholas Cruz, who was the shooter, to the FBI. The tip actually made it to the FBI.
We're just learning about that, yes.
Yeah, and I don't want to, I'm still in the early stages of corroborating and looking into that a little bit further, because it's going to be an extension of my research work and writing. But right now, with the information we have available to us, the FBI has admitted that tip never made it to their Florida office and was never followed up. Mm-hmm. And gun control is really a whole separate issue. The issue is we have to, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, people, authorities, number one, we have to diligently be observant and follow up any type of cues, because the cues are there. Mm-hmm. With the majority of these incidents. My research looked at using the Columbine school shooting with a couple shootings that occurred in Canada. And typically with these shooters, there's some source of frustration and aggression in their life.
Yes.
I referred to the frustration-aggression hypothesis, and that they get so annoyed and frustrated and feel threatened with things in their life. And when you look at the Florida shooter, they had been expelled from that high school, and that is no doubt in my mind was probably one of the catalysts for this displaced aggression that occurred.
Yes.
And the sad thing is the people who have made these killers feel threatened and feel frustrated, the eventual victims incredibly tragically had nothing to do with the original source of their frustration. Yes. And that's where this violent homicidal aggression is being displaced, like we saw at the Florida school. Something we really, and I know it was in the United States, but, we're Canada. Incidents like this have happened up here. Mm-hmm. We need to talk. We need to lower the borders and seriously have, at the political level, a lot of different talks. We have to figure out solutions to this as opposed to
open dialogue. Open dialogue is the key to almost any of these things. We'll never eradicate crime, but I know from personal experience that when a crime is perpetrated against, let's say, someone like myself, the desire is there not to discuss it because it furthers the bad feelings associated with the crime. Neither the victims nor the witnesses really want to talk about it. No one really wants to uncover the scab and get down to the meaty sores of these things. And yet, that's the only way we're going to address them. The bullying, the violent video games that you write about, those are part of it, certainly. Gun registry is certainly part of it. I mean, it all warrants discussion. And so my hat's off to people like you who are working so hard to uncover whatever you can find about it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you bring up a really good point about violent media. Not everybody that plays violent video games or watches violent movies is going to do that.
No.
Commit a heinous act. But in the research I've done, when you take a look at all these perpetrators, there's another huge factor is the contagion effect, the copycat effect, in a lot of those shootings. But when you incessantly are playing video games, violent video games, over and over, and watching violent movies, these youth really become desensitized to real-world violence.
That is the word. That's the word that we use, desensitized. Yeah. They become unempathetic.
Absolutely. No empathy for anybody. And they feel that violence is a normative way to deal with their issues in the world.
Yes.
Because it becomes so desensitized to violence. And it's extremely tragic. But in a lot of these cases, there are those cues there ahead of time that we have to be more diligent about recognizing and intervening. We have to be proactive.
That's right.
The unfortunate thing today with what's going on, I believe it's the 8th school shooting in 2018 in the United States where lives have been lost. This reactive, after-the-fact, knee-jerk response is not getting us anywhere.
No.
We have to be proactive prevention.
Yeah.
Needs to be implemented sooner than later. It's becoming too commonplace in the world.
Yeah. And again, we were talking about this, and I'm going to reveal how old I am here, but in the 60s when I was in grade school, when I was very young, people talked about the normalization of things, sensationalizing news media, for example, and things like that. And you and I know how innocent things were back then, really, but people were concerned about sensationalizing, and I am not pro-sensationalizing, don't get me wrong, but I am pro-open dialogue, whatever that takes and whatever form it takes. If somebody committed a crime A, B, C, let's discuss A, B, and C. Let's not cover one aspect of that up. Let's get down to the core of it, what caused it, what we can do to prevent it.
Absolutely. The whole point of my research is gun control is a huge issue, and that's why I say gun control is a whole separate issue, because even before that perpetrator has that AR-15 in their hands with murderous intentions typically on their mind, when you look backwards, there are those behavioral precursors that are present. That person is going through a number of different stressors in their life that become apparent with a lot of the people close to them. And in this case with Florida, he posted, I'm not 100% sure on what type of media form, but there was a post allegedly tied to Nicholas Cruz that said, I'm going to be a professional school shooter. And these are some of the media footprints, the paper trail that these people are leaving before the offense is even committed.
Yeah. But it raises another question. I mean, what mother, father, sister, brother, child, or teacher wants to admit in their own mind that someone that they love or care about could be evil or intent on an evil act? I mean,
you bring up a good point, Donna. It's not an easy thing to sometimes notice or recognize or to even do. To my understanding, in my early research into this case, it looked like that there was some violence at the home of the Cruz family that had been reported to the police. So this is another case that I'd love to talk a little bit more about next time, because it's, again, like the MacArthur case, it's, we're finding out more information as the days move forward.
Yeah, well, if you're willing, we'll definitely have you back in 2019, because I know you're going to have more on the MacArthur case. and more on this particular shooting too in the school. I know that your research will take you down there, and I thank you for all your research too. I am a longtime reader of true crime, and again, I am totally against sensationalizing or glorifying these criminals, but I want to know what makes them happen because I want to see them prevented.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to come back and talk about this, and I hope in the meantime that some things in the world change and we're not, hopefully not talking about any other tragic events.
That would be really good. That would be really good if we could focus on your research and your writing on these ones and not have any new ones to discuss. That would be the ideal. I have to move us to a lighter note because I've promised our listeners now I want to take you into true crime freelance journalism in particular. What can you tell any listeners who might be interested in pursuing that avenue of work?
That's a great question. You have to be, if it's something you're passionate about, I'm passionate about writing about true crime and researching it. I love getting to the root of an issue and exploring it and talking to some of the experts in the field. It's all about bolstering your platform, what you're writing about, and the more sources you can get, speaking to people, the more time you spend, the more credible, obviously, your work is going to be. And it's about partnerships too, with liaising with other crime writers as well. I'm really, discussing cases. It's all about, we don't do this for the money. I don't anyway, personally. No. It's so passionate about writing and getting these stories out. I have a story that's coming out in April in Blue Line magazine about the ISIS effect and tackling a lone wolf, and a lot of the behavioral similarities to some of these school shootings. It's the behavioral pattern, the precursors are very, very similar. There's a lot of overlap. Different type of the whole idea of radicalization, but not to get off topic, for anybody that's interested in true crime, if it's something you're passionate about writing, it's definitely an endless genre of things to write and research.
It sure is. And the thing is, most writers in any genre don't really write for the money. I mean, they may think they do, but they soon learn otherwise. But anyway, Stephen, I want to thank you. I hope you'll stay on the line for a moment. But I want to thank you for joining us on Dead to Rights today. I know you've given our listeners an awful lot to chew over on these particular cases.
Thank you very much, Donna. I really enjoyed speaking with you today.
And one more time, your website for people to go and have a look.
Absolutely. It's underworldstories.com. And if you don't mind, I'm on Twitter as well at Stephen with a PH, GM _ Junior.
Stephen with a PH _ Junior. Oh, Stephen with a PH, GM _ Junior. Yeah. Okay,
I'll
yes.
Spell it. It's at STEPHEN, GM _ Junior.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Are you on Facebook as well?
Yes, I am actually.
Okay. Very good. Very good. And if our listeners want to look me up at Dead to Rights, I'm going to be in contact with Stephen because I have already followed him. I find his work fascinating. Thank you again, Stephen. And for all our listeners, I know you've enjoyed that.
Let it rot.
I want to thank Stephen G. Metelsky, crime expert and freelance journalist, for joining us today on Dead to Rights, the podcast. You can find Dead to Rights at deadtorights.ca or at our Facebook page. Our Twitter handle is at deadtorightspod. We'd love to hear from you at carrickpublishing.com or at our Carrick Publishing Facebook page. You can find me, Donna Carrick, on Twitter at Donna _ Carrick, or at my website, donnacarrick.com. If you're a published author and would like to join our listeners on the pod, contact me at carrickpublishing@rogers.com and say schedule me for an interview. Join us next week when we bring you Jun Ying Kirk, author of the Journey to the West trilogy, all the way from the United Kingdom. Our Dead to Rights theme song is Eyes of Gold, composed and performed by Ted Carrick, who also brought us the original story scoring music. Thanks for joining us. See you next week.
A dusty road, a man alone. His vital signs go on hold. And I don't know what you've been told, but the years have turned my eyes gold. And I told you what you told me, we'd never be in the same boat for free. Yet it rides, let it rock.